This is the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening. Hello, Flyers fans, and welcome to another edition of the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of sportstalkphilly.com. I'm your host, Kevin Durso, joined by Rob Riches. And when we left you last week, we were basically looking at the next 3 or 4 games, the fourth game being Tuesday night against Ottawa of this week, as really the final chance for the Flyers to move forward without making any sort of change. Forget what happened on Friday. A 4-0 shutout win over the Rangers doesn't sugarcoat the other two performances in any way. The Flyers fell behind 4-0 in the first period of Wednesday's game to Buffalo before losing 5-2, and then they fell behind 4-0 in the first period on Saturday in Toronto and never even got on the board in a 6-0 loss. That sealed it for me, and it sealed it for many other people. A change had to happen. I wrote about it on Sunday in a column that went up on both sportstalkphilly.com and 97.3 ESPN.com. And I was honestly, knowing what happened on Saturday, I was honestly preparing myself for something to happen this week. I was keeping an eye on things, an ear out for anything that might be coming down, whether it was Sunday morning or early afternoon, even the possibility that it could have been Saturday after the game. That's how soon I thought something might happen. You just never know. Especially, you go back a year ago and when the Flyers were on that 10-game losing streak, when they held a team meeting or it was they weren't opening up the locker room right after the final home game of that, or not the final home game, I'm sorry, the San Jose game. That was game 9 of 10. And the idea was, could something be happening right now that they're preventing the media from being let into the locker room because something's being decided? They might be having a team meeting, but maybe they're informing the players of a change. Maybe there's a coaching change going on. Maybe something else has happened. Who knows? And nothing ever came of it. They wrote it out, and they did end up making the playoffs that year. Beside the point, you knew a change was going to come at some point. So I was prepared for something to happen, first on Saturday night, then Sunday morning through the early afternoon. And eventually you got to the point on Sunday where you realized it wasn't going to happen today. So Monday comes, and you're thinking maybe after Tuesday's game, maybe in the 3-day break that the team will have from game action starting on Wednesday and going up until Saturday when they travel and face the Penguins, something was going to happen. I don't think we expected this to be the story that we were talking about this week and tonight as we sit down and do this. The Flyers announced on Monday morning that GM Ron Hextall was relieved of his duties. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Rob for some thoughts in a moment because I know he has some, and I'll start by saying this. This is the right move for the Flyers to make on one condition, and that's only if Ron Hextall himself was not willing to do anything to improve this team in the here and now when it was desperately needed. If this is the organization's decision to make a move, then it's completely and 100% wrong to do this before anything else. If this is the only thing that they're doing in terms of making a move, it's completely wrong to do this. It's very rare you see a GM let go in the middle of a season, unlike a coaching change. So if this is, I get this change completely. If this is Ron Hextall taking the fall first because he would not fire Dave Hakstol, because he wouldn't make a trade to improve the team, because he didn't make a specific roster move or do something that could change the outcome of the season, and especially, if it, going back to Hakstol, if that means, if this is what it's going to take to get the coaching staff to undergo a change, then I understand it. If Ron Hextall stood there at the end of all this and said the only way that Dave Hakstol's going down is if I go down with him, then I guess you do what you have to do. And the only thing that they're waiting on with the coaching staff is, let's hire a new GM first and let that guy have a little bit of a say in whoever the incoming coach is and go from there. The issue with this is this could very well set the Flyers back into the same situation they were in when Hextall started. They have cap space because they were frugal spenders. They didn't just go out and throw money around and give up the cap space. Ron Hextall worked them out of that situation. They have a prospect pipeline because they built from within and they didn't go for the quick fix trade. If the answer to this is to revert back to those ways, it could provide some temporary satisfaction to a fan base because Maybe they make the playoffs out of that. Maybe they win a playoff series because they really turn it around in the right way. But it may not get you to the finish line, and that's going to be a problem too eventually. I will say this. If it was a very clear difference in philosophy that Hextall was willing to let this continue for the rest of the season, into next season, and the season after that, and not do anything to change the path and the process, then yes, you had to put a stop to it. But if this is your idea of making a change just to make one, then you've got it all wrong. This has to be a cleaning house kind of change. This has to be the first domino to fall in a complete house cleaning from not just general manager, but now you're talking general manager, coaching staff, maybe other positions as well are going to get all sorts of makeovers as well out of this. But this has to be a decision that influences the next one. So the coaching staff should be on thin ice. Players should certainly be wary, but you do need to establish stability quickly because that can really have an effect on a way the team plays. So if you're trying to save the season here, you have 3 games in the next 10 days. And I have no problem with you sacrificing 2 games to get the next group in place, the next GM, the next head coach, a coaching staff. You want to do all of that in the next 10 days or a little beyond that, whatever you have until, between these 3 games here. I have no problem with that. But if you don't completely figure this out in that time, then you have an issue on your hands for the rest of the season. Players wondering if they're going to be traded, a coaching staff that has to keep that thought in the back of their mind, regardless of what they're going to tell you. And if you're doing that to save the season, then you really do have a week to figure it all out. Because after that, you may be forfeiting this season with the roles and responsibilities you are trying to fill and the potential for changes to be made hanging over the organization all day. So, Rob, let's get your thoughts because I know you weren't a fan of the move, but is that your reasoning? Is your reasoning kind of level with mine that if this is the only thing they do, then it's wrong because Ron Hextall didn't deserve to be the scapegoat for the problems here? But if he was standing up for maybe not making a coaching change or was really stubborn about certain roster moves that could make the team better, the way he handled prospects or whatever you want to look at, is that your reasoning behind it? Because is it that this is the first thing, and then if nothing else follows, then you use the wrong guy as a mercy killing?
Because to be honest with you, Kevin, I do feel as though the idea, whether or not he was, refusing to fire Dave Hakstol kind of out of a protection for Dave Hakstol, I think it's something where, it's not necessarily that he wanted to protect Dave Hakstol. I think it's just, Ron Hextall is a guy who, what we've learned about him so far is that he's very my way or the highway. And, he's somebody who's convinced that his plan can work, and his plan absolutely could have worked if you saw it through to fruition. But it's one of those things that Hextall was his guy from day one. A very very ride or die kind of guy, and if it's something where he was willing to put his own job on the line just so he wouldn't have to fire his guy, that's admirable in a sense. That's loyalty to likes that you don't see very often in hockey, and something that I would give Ron Hextall a pat on the back for. But unfortunately, loyalty doesn't always work in pro hockey, as we've learned, throughout the history of the Philadelphia Flyers, and it's something where loyalty can only get you so far, and sometimes blind loyalty can be as much of a detriment as much as anything else, and it's something where I do think that what the big issue is that because as we've seen with Dave Hakstol, I think that I love the guy as far as a player development thing is concerned, but I think honestly it's at the point where he's leading a very unprepared hockey club out there to take the ice on a nightly basis, and it's something where what works for you, what gets you success in college, isn't always going to translate to the professional level. These aren't college kids with a dream that he's working with there. These are grown men for the most part that he's working with that are looking to take that next step. And it's something where you bring in a guy like Dave Hakstol. I mean, the things that worked for college players aren't always going to work with professional players. You're going to have players tuning him out, and it's something where it almost feels like that's the case. And I don't think Ron Hextall is very wise to it. And it comes down to a matter of the organization just stepping in and saying, well, you're not gonna do this. You're not gonna get this guy out of here. Well, we'll just get you out of here. And it's something where you know. I think that's something that really shouldn't have been as much of a priority. I think Ron Hextall is a guy they absolutely should have hung on to as long as they could. But obviously, I mean, watching that hockey club take the ice on Saturday, I mean, I don't even think they could have beat a youth team at that point. I mean, it was just one of the most dreadful performances I think I've ever seen watching the National Hockey League. Toronto just went out there and just they ran roughshod. They could have done whatever they wanted to on the ice out there that night. That's just how ridiculous it is. And a lot of that was. I get why Dave Hakstol would have wanted to go with Calvin Pickard that game because he's riding a shutout. But then when you factor in the fact that they're traveling, they're going north of the border, and you have the Maple Leafs old AHL goalie. These guys know his weaknesses. They know how to pick him, and that's something where that's just mind boggling as far as I'm concerned. And so Ron Hextall is a guy that. I think is going to be very well missed. He's somebody that he really set out on a plan, but I think that it's something where there were a lot of gaps. I think that he was so focused on getting his way, and I think it's what cost him at the end of the day.
I think that's fair, and so basically, I think we both kind of said in our own way, we said the same thing, which is that look, when it came down to it, if he was so stubborn to his own ways that he wasn't going to budge for anybody, then ultimately he's not the boss of the team. Essentially, he's in charge of a lot of personnel decisions, obviously as the general manager, but he does have bosses. Whether it's Paul Holmgren as the team president or everybody above that in upper management, the owners of the team and the ownership, and the object is that if you weren't going to make a change, then you were going to be the change. That's how I've been putting it to a lot of people, is if you weren't going to make a change, then you're going to be the first change that's made. And we'll go and do what we have to do to make the right decisions to try to move this team forward. I do think you bring up a great point because, I one of the not cool questions, because there's nothing's cool about this type of day at all, but one of the interesting questions I faced or heard a lot of throughout the day is also what Ron Hextall's legacy is as a general manager with this team, and what, between the things that may have been his downfall, the things that may have been his strengths, and I think generally what we always keep coming back to when we're talking about it is that there was no doubt that Ron Hextall was a great GM when it came to working the salary cap, making roster decisions that helped free up cap space and maybe got you something small in return, whether it was a draft pick or a lower end player or a prospect or something. He built up a prospect pipeline that the Flyers didn't have in years past. How many, you just go over the first round picks that he had to use in his 5 years as GM, or 5 drafts as GM. I'll say it that way. That's 8 first rounders coming in, not to mention some of the other talent that he's been able to pick up. So you have a lot of prospects that came into the system, a lot of them playing with the NHL team now when you factor in Travis Sanheim, Ivan Provorov, Travis Konechny, Nolan Patrick. All these guys were draft picks under Hextall. So he made, a lot of picks that built up the pipeline. It's interesting that I think about it, because if these prospects all turn out to be better, or better than they are now, or see their games taken to a whole new level under a different coaching staff, because let's face it, none of those kids know anything other than playing in Dave Hakstol's system, and from the day they were drafted by Ron Hextall, it's the same regime that made the decision to bring them into the organization, to bring them up into the NHL, and then to put them in the lineup. So to see these guys actually possibly play under somebody else, maybe does that change things? If this team, I've seen a lot of comparisons like this, and it's a viable comparison because Ron Hextall is turning out to be the Ed Wade of the Flyers here, in a sense, where, Ed Wade with the Phillies drafted a lot of the players that were on a World Series winning team and ultimately came up over the course of time, but he didn't get to see that to the finish line because ultimately they weren't making the final steps to really become a contender. It's really not all that different from Hextall's situation at this point, where you're laying a foundation. You think, just look at some of the players that they've drafted. You think you found your top defenseman. You think you found at least 1, maybe 2 top forwards right there. You think you found the goalie of the future, and the idea is getting it to the finish line and pairing it up with the right pieces in the here and now. It seemed like Hextall didn't put enough value on the here and now and worried so much about the future and laying the foundation that he lost sight of the here and now and trying to build a team into a contender. And, look, I agree with another thing I saw, which is, the 2 playoff appearances don't help you when you're trying to have a process and build, because it indicates that you're closer to being a contender than what you maybe really are. Look, we haven't hesitated to kind of tell it like it is when it came to those 2 playoff appearances. You kind of backed your way into those more than you were in them the whole way through. How many times, and maybe this is why we were also, this is part of why we were sitting here for several of the last few weeks doing this podcast and talking about needing a change to be made, maybe in a different way, because Hextall's plan had merit. It was just that, how long can you sit there and watch year after year go by with the same thing? You've set different expectations. You have players walking around with T-shirts that say "raise the bar," meaning that you want to take that step forward, the proverbial next step into being more of a contender, which in my eyes, as I said throughout the off seasons we led up to, and we kind of all agreed with it, it meant you're not going to make the playoffs in the last week of the season or on the final game of the season. You're going to make the playoffs comfortably. You're going to look like a team that can actually win a playoff series. That's taking the step forward. Nobody was asking the Flyers to be a Stanley Cup contender this year necessarily, but they were asking for a clear sign of improvement. A record like 10-11-2 through 23 games is not a clear improvement. It's basically the status quo. They're riding a path of mediocrity here. Could it get better if Hextall's plan kind of sees its way all the way through? Sure, but how much longer were they going to wait, and how much longer were they going to wait to make a decision on certain players? Because, like, truth be told, there are certain players or the coach or whatever it is. I'm with you, Rob, on those. Well, I'm going to say both games. I mean, the Toronto game was as bad as I've seen also, but I really thought that the first 10 minutes of the Buffalo game was an atrocity as well, just because you can see it. You can see how unprepared and inept the team is coming out to start a game, and then Dave Hakstol is going to call a timeout 9 minutes in after the third Buffalo goal on a power play, and you can see him sitting there saying "let's go" or whatever. It's like, let's go. That message gets delivered 30 minutes before the game in the locker room, not 9 minutes into the game while you're calling a timeout down 3-0. If you're not ready to go, you're not ready to go. And that's just the harsh reality of the situation, is that they were not ready to go on Wednesday. They were not ready to go on Saturday, and it showed in both games. And that to me that's why Saturday was a final straw for me, because what were you how many more times are you supposed to let that kind of game happen? How many more times are you supposed to lose a game? You had the 8-2, 6-1, 6-0. How many times are you supposed to have that happen before that becomes more consistent than your lack of consistency overall? Maybe you're just going to consistently lose terribly a couple games out of every month, and that'll show them, it's ridiculous. So it seemed logical, and that's why I was kind of on high alert with the coaching. But to me, maybe that's the first thought that comes into my mind when Ron Hextall is the one who's taking the fall on this particular day, is that you weren't going to make any change. You were going to let this ride out because you stood by it so firmly that you were going to let it ride out and assume that the season was going to be saved, and it wasn't. They weren't. Nobody's waiting for you here to save this. It was time to do something. So that's where this kind of came from. I personally looked at Ron Hextall going, when it came down to it, Ron Hextall had 2 particularly notable flaws that we could point out, because, I spent the entire first intermission on Saturday running the Twitter account in between the periods. I rarely sit there in between periods and go through all the comments and things like that. And sometimes, truth be told, we don't see tons of comments come in. We see a few and we communicate with some of them, but there's usually not many that make you want to, hit respond. I'll hit like a few times throughout the game, but you're not going to respond on Twitter near as much, not to every single comment that comes in. But when it was 4-0, 12 and a half minutes into the game on Saturday, it felt kind of right to just spend as much time as possible from that point forward, only worrying about maybe putting a tweet out regarding the game when somebody scored, and focusing the rest of the time on conversation for the most part. And a lot of it was directed toward the coach. There were some people that thought the GM was the one at fault here. And at the same time, I was, because one argument against it was they've used 5 goalies this season. That's absurd. It is absurd. And I will level with somebody there and I'll go, you know what? That's one flaw against Ron Hextall. If you went into this season, it actually doesn't date back to this past offseason. It dates back almost 2 years now, because there was no reason for Michael Neuvirth to get another contract, but he signed him to an extension anyway. Then you came to this past offseason, you've got 3 prospects that are going to enter camp. You've got one veteran goalie who's coming off of a major surgery, from core muscles and all of that, and that needed time to recover. He may not be, it was very borderline that he was going to be ready for the season opener. Then you had Neuvert, who was out for a chunk of the preseason, missed the start of the season, came back for one game, got hurt again. The way that Hextall was so naive towards it in terms of not seeing the injuries that could come from this and coming up with a better backup plan than that. If you wanted to do a goalie tandem that didn't include Carter Hart, I get it. We kind of understood and I think we understand it now better than we did at the beginning of the season, because during the preseason and training camp, when Brian Elliott's trying to recover and getting into whatever preseason game he can get into, and Michael Neuvirt's not playing in preseason games except for maybe one, and all these other prospects are getting into a few games and also dealing with injuries or coming off of injuries of their own, Carter Hart's putting up the best numbers. Carter Hart's putting up the best numbers of any goalie in the preseason, but you kind of understood why he was going to go down. If he was going to make it, he was going to make it, and if not, then nothing was going to let him make it. And you've seen him in the minors so far this year have a little bit of an inconsistency deal of his own, and that's just the adjustment process. It's an adjustment, but you've seen him have a few struggles to understand why that year in the AHL may be so important. So I don't fault that one, but I do look at it and I go, I don't know if that's the breaking point. I've heard that that's part of it. I've heard that Paul Holmgren wanted Carter Hart up here and Hextall wasn't going to do it, and that had part of the reasoning behind it. I do think that
was that Twitter report that apparently Pierre Maguire was talking about how Holmgren wanted it, but Hextall wanted to stick with it, so he fired him.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that the story would hold. I think the story would hold more water here and be more credible if this was something from the beginning of the year. If you were looking at him in the preseason and going, Carter Hart's playing better than Brian Elliott and Michael Neuvert. Michael Neuvert's not going to start the season because he's hurt, and Alex Lyon's not going to start right away because he's hurt, and Anthony Stolarz is coming off an injury, so probably not the best idea there. Let's put it this way. Why, when you look at why Calvin Pickard's here right now, it tells you everything you need to know. They weren't going to play Carter Hart. So if they weren't going to play Carter Hart, you went out and you grabbed some guy off the waiver wire who was the backup goalie on the Calder Cup winning Toronto Marlies last year. That's how bad he was, or how low in the organization he was, that he wasn't the number 1 for Toronto or the number 2 for Toronto or the number 1 for the AHL team. He was the number 2. So he's the 4th goalie in line, and you watch him in a start like that on Saturday, kind of not surprising to see why. So the fact that Ron Hextall didn't do anything to address goaltending from one year to the next to have a better stopgap, he tried over the course of the year before, you could say, because, or maybe because, Steve Mason was on his way out the door, and I think that was just a disagreement. Mason thought he was a number 1 all the way through. He was more of a tandem guy, and Neuvert couldn't stay healthy, so Mason became more of a number 1 in that regard. All of that stuff factors in. And you go out and get Brian Elliott, and you think that that's a guy who may fit the tandem more, and Neuvert still can't stay healthy, so Elliott becomes even more of a number 1 than you expect him to be. At the end of the day, I think with goaltending, your biggest problem with the team on the ice right now is not just the goaltending performance. It's the fact that I think the goaltenders lack a little bit of confidence, and I think that the players in front of the goaltender lack confidence because they don't feel like they're getting that stop when they need it. They feel like more or less mistakes are going to end up in the net. So it leads you to playing tense. It leads you to playing with less confidence. It makes you look like a hockey team that doesn't know what you're doing. It's weird to watch the Flyers go from the game they played on Friday against the Rangers, where you play nearly perfect hockey all the way through. You have a really good approach to the game. You stick with it. You get a lot of chances on net. You really crash the net. You get, they were in Lundqvist's face all day. And that's how you score 4 goals over time. Lundqvist was great in that game, and up until the very late stages, under 6 minutes to go in regulation, you turn it into a 2-0 game, and that fluky goal that was the opener isn't the only goal of the game anymore, and you get 2 more, one in an empty net and the other one after the fact, and you go, all right, that was a good way to approach that game, and everything worked perfectly. And at that point, you start to consider everything. The players look like they know what they're doing. They actually look like they could contend. You have a coach who looks like he's got a real system in place. Then you go watch Saturday and you go, what system? What system? Dave Hakstol doesn't have a system. There's no system to that play. It's just a bunch of people skating around aimlessly like it's the public skate at the skate zone on a Friday night, and you know, that's all well and good when you're just having a fun time with your friends or whatever, like everybody else is at a skate zone. Not when you're paid professional athletes who need to go out and do a job, and or a professional head coach in the NHL who should have a better concept of system. Like it was funny. One of the first comments I saw on Saturday was, firing the coach doesn't stop the other team from having speed. No, it doesn't. But you know what does stop the other team from having speed? Having a strategy and a system that combats it, that actually takes it out of play. You're not going to sit here and tell me the Rangers aren't a team that don't have some speed to them. Of course they do. Every team has a little bit of speed in some way. It's a matter of how well the other team takes it away. That's the bigger thing. And, it seems like every time we watch the Flyers play, someone takes away their speed or whatever speed they may have, and they've got fast players. Not everybody is, but Travis Konechny's a fast player. Jordan Wheel can be a fast player. Guys like that can be. And, there's no reason to sit there and say Claude Giroux can't get hustling a little bit when he wants to, and guys of that nature. When you take that out of the picture here, and you don't let someone play with speed, it makes the game look easier. And the Flyers don't make anything look easy because they don't have a system in place that makes it easy for them. That's what they need to do at this point. So if it comes down to it, this is what it is, then this is what it is. And you had to get rid of the GM to get rid of the coach eventually, or make a trade, or do whatever you had to do. Because I floated the idea in the article about making a significant change. Maybe it's the head coach. Maybe you trade a guy like Jake Voracek or Wayne Simmons and say, you know what? Here's a valued player in the locker room. Here's a valued part of this team, someone who can be a key contributor, and we're just not taking it anymore. It's not working, so we're making a change. And it sure as hell wakes up the rest of the guys that didn't get traded that day. It resonates, and you need to do something that resonates. Now this certainly resonates, but it's kind of the wrong mercy killing if you don't kind of correct everything else that's underlying here, because at the end of the day, firing the GM because he didn't make a move isn't going to change anything. Now you have to come in with somebody who's going to make the rest of the changes that you wanted to make. That seems to be the logical next step. I also wanted to throw out that one of the other areas where I thought Ron Hextall kind of came up short during his time, especially in the last offseason, was the lack of addressing the penalty kill. You had the cap space, while you didn't want to get tied down too much. When the best thing that you can do to try to address the penalty kill, or to think you're doing that, is signing Christian Folin, then that's not going to work out either. There were players out there, maybe they didn't sign with you, but sometimes you got to not be so hesitant to offer the one extra year that they want to get, if that's what it takes. He again, maybe this is Ron Hextall being so set in the ways of a blueprint where a guy who was a little bit older and a veteran presence but a good penalty killer wanted 3 years instead of 2, and the answer at that point was no. They weren't going to go there. Well, then maybe you got to get out of your own head a little bit and make a move that still benefits the team, that helps them win, because it wasn't going to get you anywhere. And at the end of the day, those are two areas where I think Hextall came up short, and it showed, because at the end of the day, you could have changed the goaltending situation coming into this season. Maybe you turn around and you say Carter Hart somehow is ready, and you do play him at that point, and you don't worry so much about the development angle of it. I don't disagree with what they've done with him, but maybe that's one of the changes you make. Maybe when it came to the penalty kill, you try to get another player in here who's going to help your team, and if you don't do that, then when it's not working with the coach you have, you do make that assistant coaching change and at least start there. Like that's even a final straw to an extent. If you're going to drag your feet over Ian LaPerriere because the penalty kill is doing so great with him, then maybe you do have a problem with trying to follow this blueprint to a T, where you think that the coaching staff that's here and the head coach you have here and the current team you have here is the answer to all the problems. They're just not, it's a matter of executing and all that stuff like that. I think it's a little far off base. So maybe if you were so set in your ways, it was the only move to make. Rob, what are your thoughts on those two areas?
Yeah, I mean, it's something where, just the fact that assistants were able to hang around so long, that's something that kind of baffled me a little bit. I mean, particularly with Ian LaPerriere, realistically, the only coach that I'd really assistant that I'd really have hanging around right now is Chris Knobloch. obviously because we know what he could be capable of. I think he represents so much potential, and it's something where, but guys like Ian LaPerriere, it just you wonder what he's and listen, you're never going to find somebody who's got LaPerriere's back like I do. He's a guy that he's been very valuable. I mean, he's a guy that I liked him in his earlier roots when he was kind of working in player development. But I mean, that the penalty kill out there is just it's ridiculous. I mean, it's just it's not going to get any better. You know that they're basically just throwing it at the wall right now and seeing if it sticks. It's just something where I think that you know looking inward, I mean, the assistants, it just they need an overhaul in that department. Everybody except for Knobloch really should go. I think it's something where you know they're not doing anything to improve the product. I mean, maybe Dave Hakstall is a guy who can improve with some fresher voices, but then again, it's possible that he may not as well. I mean, it's something where it's kind of a gray area there, and Hextall was a guy that I think one thing about him that I'll definitely miss is his approach to you could tell that he everything that he was doing was with that end goal of building that Stanley Cup winner in mind, and that was evident on you always saw it at the draft where everybody gets up there and it turns into some soliloquy about how congratulations to the Stanley Cup champion, okay, special thanks to this host city for all their hospitality, blah blah blah. Fans watching at our draft party that back home. Hextall just gets up there, makes the pick, gets out of there. That's something that I'll definitely miss. I mean, he didn't care about the formalities; he cared about just putting the best personnel that he could in place, and that's something about him I think I'll definitely miss.
I wanted to go back to something that you said with the coaching staff for a minute because just some of the rumblings I've heard, and it's a fair point because you even mentioned the one assistant that you think should probably stick around is Chris Knobloch, and he's the most recent addition. He was kind of brought in given the success that he had in the OHL under the Erie Otters. The way that he had coached that team and all the prospects that had gone through that system. And the rumblings I've kind of heard regarding that is that at the very least, there's no indication, truthfully, to this point, that Dave Hakstol's on his way out as a result of Ron Hextall being dismissed today. There's no indication of that. It seems logical for sure because usually a new GM wants to bring in a new coach. So it seems logical that wholesale changes are on the way to the coaching staff. What I've heard a little bit of is that Scott Gordon's done a really good job at the AHL level on special teams. They've got a top-notch power play unit. Their penalty kill has been excellent throughout the season. And the idea that, or at least the thing that I've heard in rumblings, is that Scott Gordon's going to make his way to the NHL bench potentially as an assistant coach, and Chris Knobloch would possibly, in a weird sort of way, it's not it's kind of hard to call it a complete demotion because you're being called a head coach, but he might take over as the head coach of the Phantoms and get to work more in that player development kind of role and also be the guy who's kind of calling all the shots behind the bench. It's really hard to say how much input he has on everything. He's the power play guy, but what else does he really do that Dave Hakstol doesn't do? I don't see him being, if you've ever, like when you go to a practice or you watch the training camp sessions, Ian LaPerriere's out there kind of barking out some instructions and going over some things and actually looking like he's coaching up guys. And Gord Murphy's coaching up guys. I don't see Chris Knobloch doing it as much, and maybe that's a new guy in the room kind of thing or whatever, but I do wonder if him getting the reins completely to a team might change his abilities around and make him a more valuable part of it, because it's too soon to sit there and call him a candidate for a head coach for the head coach of the Flyers for sure, if they were to try to stay internal like that. I don't think you can do that. If they were to stay internal, then the only logical option would be to grab Scott Gordon from the minors and say, you're the new head coach of the Flyers now, not the Phantoms. I don't think that that's really going to be the case. I mean, we've sat here and talked about it for a couple times over the course of the last few weeks about making a change at the head coaching position. The first time we talked about it, there were no coaching fires yet. So the object was, there's not really anywhere to go other than to grab somebody internally. And at that point, it was Scott Gordon or Chris Knobloch. Then the firing started to happen, and it was John Stevens got fired, then Joel Quenneville, then then Mike Yo and Todd McClellan. And now you got names out there that aren't going to be out there forever. So Joel Quenneville seems to me like the type of guy who would fit in really well in this organization, would give it the sense of direction that they want to have. I don't differentiate it too much from from the first time around when they dropped John Stevens as head coach and turned to Peter Laviolette, it's a guy who's got a resume, who knows how to get a team over the top. And let's be realistic about this whole situation too. Whoever inherits the GM job, whoever gets the call to be the next GM of the Philadelphia Flyers, and as a result, if there's a coaching change, whoever the next coach of the Flyers is, they're not falling into some situation where there's not pieces in place already. The Flyers have got a lot of players that are part of this core and that are part of the core that's to come. Whether you're talking about Provorov and Konechny, Nolan Patrick, or if you want to go back a little further and go players that were drafted before Ron Hextall was GM, like Shane Gostisbehere and Sean Couturier, then okay, you've got core guys and a core to come, and all that's going to be inherited by a general manager who's going to be basically told to take this thing over the top, and a head coach that needs to kind of find a way to bring it all together the right way. Because at the end of the day, when you watch this team go out there, they get, think about it. The top line is Claude Giroux, Sean Couturier, and Travis Konechny. Then your next line is Nolan Patrick, Jake Voracek, and depending on the night, could be Oscar Lindblom, could be Dale Weiss, which gives you the proverbial roll of the eyes there, and or possibly a JVR, and you got Wayne Simmons playing on your third line. Sometimes JVR's playing on that third line. You've got enough top 9 guys there that can make an impact and should make an impact. And you've got enough defensemen between Provorov and Robert Haig and Shane Gostisbehere and, Travis Sanheim that you've got enough guys in place that should be making more of an impact. They're young, so they're prone to mistakes. And maybe part of your problem is that you don't have a reliable backstop to take care of the mistakes as much as Brian Elliott has or Michael Neuwirth has not, because he hasn't played much, and that you're leaving up to Cal Pickard or Alex Lyon or Anthony Stolarz. But whoever comes in is going to inherit a pretty good situation, not only in terms of the current roster being somewhat, in somewhat of a position to make a run at some point. It just needs that push, or maybe new coaching or whatever. But you also have a prospect pipeline and plenty of draft picks as well. Benefit and any GM would benefit any GM. The number of first round picks, the number of guys who aren't here yet. Between German Rubtsov and Morgan Frost and Joel Farabee and Jay O'Brien and Phil Myers is still in the minors, and Mikhail Vorobiev got a taste of the NHL and went back to the minors. You got guys like that floating around. Nick Aube-Kubel is another one who got a taste of the NHL and went back down. There's a lot of guys who are right there on the borderline, and you'd like to see somebody come in who can give them a little bit of a sense of direction. Get these guys up into the lineup at some point over the course of the next few years. Get the current roster going so you're not missing a beat here. There's ways to do this. So that's where my curiosity lies. I do think Hakstol is probably the next domino to fall at some point. I think the whole reason it didn't happen on Monday is because there's a game on Tuesday, and the idea was go hold a practice, go get through this game. Maybe he's the coach through Saturday. I don't know. But somewhere over the course of the next 10 days, you're going to name a new GM. And when you name a new GM, maybe there might be a coaching staff to come with it. That's my guess. What are your thoughts on that, Rob?
I mean, I think it's something where, if the theory that's been floating around is accurate, that they're firing Hextall because he refused to fire Hakstol, I think it's something where Hextall could be the very well next step. I mean, it's something where they're trying to get some further things in order. They don't necessarily want to be without a general manager and head coach right now. They just want to be able to get some things sorted out. I mean, I think that Dave Hakstol is a guy who's on very, 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 very limited time right now, and it's something where he's pretty much a dead man walking at this point. There's really nothing that suggests that he'll he's around much longer. I mean, it could be against the Senators. It could be once they find a replacement. It might take them a little bit of time before they get a replacement. But I mean, my main concern is if ownership didn't exactly if they wanted him Ron Hextall to fire Dave Hakstol and he didn't do it, why didn't ownership just go ahead and flex their weight a little bit and do that? Obviously, that's not something that I have the answer to or can think of at this time. But it's just something where I don't see a circumstance whatsoever in which Dave Hakstol finishes this season as Flyers head coach. I mean, it's something where but he could very well be on his way out. I mean, I think it depends on how the hiring process goes for a new general manager, how that comes about, and whoever that may be. I mean, it's something where there's still a lot of moving parts here, and it's something where I don't really see him being around much longer whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was a little telling because Dave Hakstol spoke after all this went down. He hadn't spoken to Ron Hextall. I don't know if Ron Hextall was in the building for any point in time during the day at all, but to hear a quote like this, and I'll read the quote first and then I'll get into the kind of background on it. It's been made very clear to me what my role is and my job is as we get into the near future here, and that's what my focus is. That's where my focus is, and I've never had a problem doing that. To me, the idea that something has been set in front of him already as the role is the role. I mean, the idea here to me is that you could sit here and say that the role and the job in the near future is that Dave Hakstol is the head coach of this team until somebody tells him otherwise, or it's that whenever a new GM is named, something's going to probably come out of that. So it might be following, he might get his focus right now has to be, you have to wonder, does he have any shot of coaching himself out of this if they play well over the course of this game on Tuesday, or maybe if he gets to Saturday? Or is it or is it one of these things where it's just too late already? I mean, look at what the LA Kings did earlier this year anyway. The decision to fire John Stevens by the Kings earlier this season was made after they lost a game to the Flyers, but he coached one more game and they won that game, and then they announced it. So a decision, when your mind's been made up, even if you're just looking for the first opportunity to make the announcement without disrupting your team's schedule, maybe that's all it is. So at this point, maybe the waiting game here with that is we're just waiting for somebody to come in. So once we have the GM in place, he can advise on where we should go in terms of a head coaching search. And because at the end of the day, you have to make that decision immediately. If you're going to fire Dave Hakstol after all of this, then you have to have the replacement ready to go right away. Whether it's we're making a phone call to Scott Gordon and saying you're going to be the new head coach of the Flyers, not the Phantoms anymore, or it's a Joel Quenneville or Todd McClellan or somebody else who's been let go previously and allows you to bring that person in, get them into the organization, get them started, so to speak, so that you can actually have them ready to go by the time that first game comes up, whenever that may be, whether that's Saturday or whether that's the following Thursday. I think the Flyers typically in years past, when they've done a coaching change mid-season, have kind of, if I'm not mistaken, they usually do it in a time when it's an off day from a game, and then they also wait until they're on a stretch where they're home for a little bit. So in other words, to me, you're not going to get through next Thursday's game against Columbus and go into a 5-game road trip that includes a back-to-back against Buffalo and Winnipeg. And then once you're finished with Winnipeg, you're already in Western Canada to face Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver through the end of that weekend. And then you're on the week of the holidays as it comes up. You have 3 games at home, 1 on the road, and then Christmas hits. And they take a 3-day break right there, and the league freezes, so you won't be seeing any decisions made there. To me, if you go any more than a week and a half without making a coaching change, you're not making one this year. And in fairness, it's not out of the realm of possibilities to wait. The issue that I have with waiting is that I don't know what you're expecting to get out of that. Who are you expecting to become available that isn't already available? You've got a perfectly legitimate coach with a Hall of Fame resume waiting out there. McClellan's not even a bad option. I don't like him as much as Quenneville, but he's not even a bad option because he has led a team to sustain success before as well. It's not like taking a chance on a college coach or bringing in somebody who has very little background or very little of a successful track record. It's, guys who have done something in the past. So maybe that's the direction you turn. I don't know. But I mean, first things first, they have to get a GM in here first and foremost. And I think, like I said, I think Dean Lombardi's the obvious choice because he's already in the organization. And he has that tie and the resume as a former Stanley Cup champion with the Kings. I feel like we're not talking about Chris Pryor enough as an internal option. And then a couple names that were floated, there were names floated out in reports. There's names that are in total speculation. There was one report that said that if in terms of external options that may get a call or an interview or something of the sort, Ron Francis, who is currently in the process of divesting equity in Carolina at the moment, and Chuck Fletcher, who is the former Wild GM, who's currently a senior advisor with the Devils. They were named in a specific report from Darren Dreger. Other names that were floated around: Chris Pronger, who is obviously a former Flyer. He's currently in the Florida organization, wants to be a GM. Steve Yzerman is a name that you figure just because he stepped down as the Lightning GM before this season began. The idea is that he's going to want to go back to Detroit to be the GM there whenever it opens up. But if you can entice a guy with an offer now, you can try to see what happens. You got to, it's at least possibly worth kicking the tires on. And, even the idea of names like, Danny Briere and Dave Poulin were floated around as well. I don't think that there's no substance to any of those. It's all speculation for the most part. We can sit here and tell you Francis and Fletcher were named in a report. That's about it. And, the idea here is that Dean Lombardi is going to be the guy who is probably going to get the reins here, but we won't know that right away, and we'll have to see where it goes. But it's, to me, the biggest question that the Flyers face right now is what's next. And I think what's next is, in the early portion here, is first getting some answers to some of the questions about why this was the decision made. It was really hard to have those questions answered when a press conference is scheduled for the following day, and that's where the team see, the Comcast CEO and Paul Holmgren are going to sit down and give you a little bit more in terms of what went into this decision, why it happened, why now, and maybe what's to follow. Otherwise, what's next is, quite frankly, kind of an awkward hockey game against the Ottawa Senators tomorrow, which I find a little ironic. I don't know if you do, Rob, in the sense that it's a little ironic because Ottawa was a team that was a franchise that was in shambles at one point in time. I mean, there's not a clear controversy or idea that a goalie or a coaching change is going to happen, or anything in terms of management, but they've made so many changes to the roster, and they've had a lot of drama around the roster and a lot of fires to put out, and not to mention that they've kind of just started a rebuild process, that it's kind of interesting to watch one somewhat dysfunctional organization have to take on one that's in a dysfunctional state of its own right now.
Well, Ottawa is still a completely different situation than the Flyers are in. They got a situation where they're run by an owner right now who just completely does not care whatsoever about what he does. He's just throwing caution to the wind at this point. He's just completely reckless, and as a result, everything else is just falling into complete chaos.
Oh yeah, no question about that. I just found it ironic that that's the situation, that those are the two teams playing each other in this particular game, because it's already going to be awkward enough. I mean, I know that for myself, sitting on press row tomorrow, I'll probably catch myself looking down to that corner box where Ron Hextall would normally reside for games, and it hasn't just been Ron Hextall at times. Paul Holmgren's around upstairs, and Bobby Clark's watching games from in there as still an involved member of the front office of the organization. Somebody knew was going to be over there, and maybe Chris Pryor is the acting GM for now, not necessarily Paul Holmgren, but Holmgren's conducting the search. And that's the thing. So you wonder where this goes and what's next, because I think you wonder what's next also because you wonder how much longer they're going to go before they start making any other decisions.
I don't know if I would go as far as to call the firing of Ron Hextall a panic move at this point. I mean, it's something where it feels like it has the makings of that, but it's something where they're looking for a change. They're looking to make something happen. They're looking to just if they're able to expedite the rebuild a little bit. I mean, you see the empty seats at Wells Fargo Center on game night. It's something where it's not looking pretty. Things are looking bleak, especially when you have a Super Bowl winning Eagles team, 10 months removed from that. And, you have the Sixers, who are firmly in win now mode right now, especially after going out and getting a superstar caliber player in Jimmy Butler. You look, and obviously, things are all different. Each team. I mean, you can't really, fairly compare how everybody conducts business, but it's something where, you have, teams that are, looking to make that next step, and the Flyers are still not at that point yet. And it's got a lot of people frustrated. at the games themselves, on Twitter, different social media outlets and whatnot. It's something where it looks like that people get the impression that the Flyers aren't really caring that much, and that they're not caring about a good on ice product, and it's something where the heads at Comcast, Dave Scott and whatnot, they see this and they go, well, something's got to change. We've got to reinvigorate interest in this team. It's something where, the environment, the game day atmosphere at Wells Fargo Center is just completely different than what it was, 5, 10, even 3 years ago. And it's something where, they're looking to make that change and they're looking to try to speed things up a little bit. They want to get back into the win now mode that they were in that dominated much of their existence. I mean, it's something where, they weren't satisfied with the status quo. Things were moving a little too slow, and as a result, heads have rolled, and I think that further heads are going to roll.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I think at this point you had no choice but to do something about it because it was turning into a situation of complete apathy, and it's hard to go into a building, especially look, Rob. I think the best way to put this is you and I both know this situation because we've grown up in this in the area, gone to games as kids, and been around this team for our whole entire lives in different capacities. Now we're doing it in this format and in this way, and going in a different capacity than we used to. But you'll go and we would go, and when we went when we were, 9, 10, 11 years old and would go to a game or go to a playoff game, you know, atmosphere was king and it hasn't been anymore.
Let's also not forget Ron Hextall's, contributions have been what people have liked for so long. Ron Hextall always kind of made waves as, hey, here's this guy who was a complete hothead during his playing days, and now he's patient. Now it seems like he's matured, he's mellowed out. He's taken the right approach to doing this, the right approach to building a team, and it's something where, he the way that he was able to stockpile assets, he was able to pretty much become one of the envies of the league. A lot of people like the situation that he's been able to acquire, and what he's been able to build, and the fact that he's been able to guide the Flyers out of salary cap hell, which is a monumental achievement in and of itself. And it's something where when it all comes down to it, I mean, this is not an unfair situation for an outsider to be coming into. It's something where you know. Uh, guys, a guy can come in. It seems like he's, pretty much, a lot of the grunt work's been taken out of the way of it all, and I think it's something where, you look at, which of these young assets, could be, hanging around, who could be on their way out soon enough. I mean, it's as much as you hate to say it, you hate to see it as well, but. You also wonder if a franchise guy like Wayne Simmons can be moved for a guy who can, a serviceable goalie who can be the bridge to Carter Hart's arrival. I was taking a look at the pending free agent goalies next summer, and it's something that I wasn't very impressed by, and I think that that's something that can be addressed by a trade. So it's something where, a situation like that is liable to happen, and there's still a lot of uncertainty floating around, and we'll see how it all goes.
Yeah, the next few days are going to be really, really crazy. I think the first things first is that you're going to go through Tuesday, and it's going to be first the press conference at 11, which is going to kind of shed some light on the reasoning behind this, some answers to some questions about what maybe has happened that kind of forced a hand on this decision. You wonder if there's any other decisions that are going to be made within the next 24 hours, and then the team's going to have to go out and play a game. And when that game is over, what's going to happen from there? Because at that point, there's an awful lot of time to sit and stew in that for a little, especially if it's not a good result. Because if you don't beat Ottawa on Tuesday, you get Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to not only sit there and think about it, but the idea that this does not mean, this one change does not mean the end all be all here, that there could be more coming. So it could make Wednesday a pretty busy day, could make Thursday a busy day. It could make Friday up until the team has to travel out a busy day. Then you're going to play a game on Saturday. And after that, you get 4 more days off. And I feel like somewhere in the range of that, whether, well, I think Tuesday, you're not going to hear any news because there's a game to be played that night, and I think that you're gonna let everything hold out for now through that game. But from there, the 8 days that follow, I don't hold anything, out of the I don't keep anything out of the question with this team at this point. I think that it finally all came to a head, and, it's interesting. I think we might have talked for all of a minute to a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes on the actual gameplay from the last week, the 3 games that we had talked about coming in. Ron Hextall being let go as GM is significant. So, it was obviously gonna dominate the conversation. But I don't think that I don't see how this can be the end of the line. I just don't see how it can be the only thing that you do at this point. When this news broke, I kind of was I was disappointed in the fact that it was Hextall first in a way. I figured there was something more to it than simply letting him go. But at the same time, I was honestly just happy to see them make any sort of change because I was trying to honestly over the course of the last few days, especially when Saturday night the game happens, everything else kinda comes and goes, and then Sunday morning came and went as well. And my thought kinda shifted to, what are we supposed to do if this is the way that this is gonna be for the rest of this season? You know, whether it's between coaching, between GM, whatever it is, you could sense that something wasn't right with this team, and not just in the sense that they weren't playing well. It was, there was a tolerance for getting beat up 6 to nothing, and that just can't be. And in hindsight now, that statement is completely false to begin with because there wasn't tolerance for it. They made a move based off of that, insisting that something had to be done. Now, again, like we said, whether or not that's Hextall not being willing to do something and losing his job as a result, or that being the decision that the Flyers organization made above him to let him go, whatever it may be, it's still significant enough that it starts to send shockwaves through the organization. And the idea, it sends shockwaves not just through the organization, but it also sends shockwaves in my mind. In my mind, I don't see any reason for it to hold anything else back. In fact, it just makes it even more likely that something's going to happen. So, you know, this last hour has been a little bit of a, you know, I don't want to call it a tribute because it's never a good day when somebody gets fired, but at the same time, we felt like we knew something was going to happen, and it's pretty rare for us to come on here on this show, just like it is for writing purposes as well, in writing articles. I'm not a fan of doing it, and I think I can speak for Rob when I say this too. We're not a fan of writing a story or coming on a podcast like this and sitting here and telling you that a change is necessary. You don't want to sit here and talk about what your team needs to do, or the team, or what the team that you guys are all fans of here who listen to us. You don't want to hear what they need to do to make the change and get better. Sometimes when you talk about getting better, you're talking about one player or making one significant upgrade, not kind of having to overhaul the process. But this is where we are. And the reality was that we kind of put the focus on the coach, put the focus on the players, and waited for the GM to do something about it. And ultimately, it was the GM who got the axe first because he was the one who was let go before getting the chance to even make a move, unless he, or it's unfair to even say before getting the chance to, because he had chances to make that move and he just didn't. And that's what it probably came down to. So as we start to wrap things up this week, I do want to just start off by saying that we'll be back on next week with a show because we absolutely, without question, have to come back next week to gauge what's happened in the days since. Whether it's, we'll record something over the later part of the weekend, maybe either Sunday or Monday of next week, probably. And when we do, it's the idea that who knows how much this franchise is going to have changed by then. That's really the key. Who knows how much they will have changed in that time. And if they feel like they have any other changes to make, or if changes haven't been made, we'll be sitting here questioning something, whether or not it's that the right guy was hired or the right decision was made regarding the coach or the players or whatever. We'll also have 2 more games to look at though those are very small stories at this point. There are certainly a lot of things that are bigger picture right now than the players or the coaching staff or what's to come. There's a lot of things bigger than 2 games. It's the players, the coaching staff, everything that goes into that. And we'll have to go from there and see where it goes. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Flyerdelphia podcast. We want to thank everyone for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the Flyerdelphia podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Also, remember to check us out on SoundCloud as part of the Sports Talk Philly podcast network. Remember, you can listen to us and shows on the rest of the Philly sports scene through the podcast network. The Phillies Nation podcast on Sports Talk Philly covering the Phillies, the Pick Swap pod covering the Sixers, and the Kelly Green Boys covering the Eagles. So, again, next week could be a lot happening in this franchise and with this organization over the course of the next 7 days or so. We will be back next week to discuss whatever happens regarding a new GM, maybe a change to the coaching staff, maybe a change to the roster. 2 more games are going to be played in the middle of all this. It's going to be crazy, but we'll be here for you just like we are throughout the season. So thank you again for tuning in. For Rob Riches, I'm Kevin Durso, and this has been the Flyerdelphia podcast on SportsTalkPhilly.com. This has been the Flyerdelphia podcast, part of SportsTalkPhilly.com, with Kevin Durso, Rob Riches, and Dan Heening.